Subway is one of the paintings that could be most linked to the cultural anxieties that were felt during the 1950s, I think. I always think of it as a painting showing a sort of urban purgatory.
Subway was the first painting that was bought by a museum. The Whitney bought it.
I think the reason why it touched a nerve is because it hit so many different points in the culture and got it right in 1950. This is the Cold War, after all.
I think it really captures the alienation and the anxiety that people felt during the Cold War. It also is wrapped up very much in notions of surveillance during this period.
Just a few months, really, before Tooker either started working on the painting or finished it, George Orwell's 1984 was published. And there are a number of concerns that Orwell describes in his work of fiction that seem to be coming true about surveillance, about distrusting the government, about not knowing whether you could trust your fellow citizen and what kinds of motives they had. Subway is a reaction to, I think, some of those wider cultural issues, but it's also a reaction to what he witnessed in America in moving through urban spaces, in taking the subway. It's actually based on Tooker's own intimate knowledge of what that architecture feels like on the body. I think a lot of viewers to Tooker's work know what kinds of confusing, lair-like, labyrinth-like spaces subway stations can be, and how uncomfortable the crowds can be. The unsure looks and the paranoia and the anxiety and the gestures of protection that the people have in that painting, it's a common experience that we've all had.
Well, Government Bureau actually comes from an experience that the artist had when he was renovating a brownstone in Brooklyn. He was required to get a number of permits for the renovation. The encounter with the bureaucracy of the city government led to the creation of Government Bureau. And in the painting we see a number of the same people repeated, standing in line. What they're waiting for, it's not exactly clear, but they are standing in front of these government administrators, perhaps, but we don't see them. We only see their eyes and their ears. And again, I think the notion of surveillance plays a large role in the creation of this painting. And the figures behind the glass that you can't see except for their hands and their eyes and their ears end up becoming anonymous instruments of the state. There were three major social protest paintings in the 1950s that the artist created: Subway, Government Bureau, and The Waiting Room. The Waiting Room is a mystery in many ways. Clearly these figures have been sequestered in some sort of room here. There are a series of repeating numbered stalls in the painting that seem to go on forever. We don't quite know why they're there. We don't quite know what they're waiting for. But clearly it's not a happy place. And there is a very mysterious figure in the left of the painting who seems to be watching over the other people. He certainly has the look of some sort of government agent. Throughout Tooker's career, we see a general shift in the tenor of his works. The early works are very much filled with anxiety and angst and alienation. Those really are at the center of the early works from the 1950s. By the early 1960s, we begin to see the artist move away from that and toward subjects that are filled with more empathy and compassion. And this has to do with his involvement in the civil rights movement.
He participated in the Selma Montgomery March with his partner, William Christopher, also an artist.
I believed in integration. And Bill Christopher and I went down to Selma Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called for people to come to Selma, and so we went. I lived across the street from a Puerto Rican rooming house, and that's how the window pictures sort of started. They were a lot frequently about miscegenation. I believed in intermarriage, of racial intermarriage, and I wanted to paint about that.
I think it also shows up in his work throughout his career, this sort of realization that people are not sort of 100% one thing or another thing, that you know, we're all sort of a mix. We're a mix of gender and we're a mix of race. And, you know, and at one point when someone asks him about race, he sort of says, well, we're not all pure.
I just knew that I wanted to paint about things that I, you know, I observed and that I felt strongly about. I really cared about what I was painting.
Tooker is very much invested in this kind of thing. He paints two pictures that really, I think, are inseparable from these experiences. One is a painting called Supper that recasts an African-American figure in emulation of Christ in a scene where he's flanked by two male figures who have more than a passing resemblance to William Christopher and George Tooker.
That picture alludes to the Supper at Emmaus. It was not done as an illustration of the Supper at Emmaus, but I was thinking they didn't recognize Christ until he put his hands on the bread to break the bread. It was his breaking the bread that they realized he was Christ. That's why I made him black. I was thinking specifically of Dr. King.
There's another painting, as I mentioned, Lunch, that shows a whole number of people seated at lunch counters in very tightly confined space, and yet none of them are making any kind of contact with one another. And the only figure who's not obstructed by another body or an architectural detail is this African-American man who is quietly eating and absorbed in his thoughts. It's an emotionally charged and politically charged environment, and that Tooker is turning to this at a particular moment in the mid-1960s, I think really comes out of his very personal experience and emotional experience with Dr. King and other civil rights workers.
I decided after I'd painted pictures about what I disliked, I've decided I wanted to do some positive pictures, and I think the first one was bird watchers.
Yeah, he talks about it as finally doing an optimistic picture. This wonderful painting in which one of the figures is very much based on Paul Cadmus, the face of Paul Cadmus, one of the figures who's in the sort of second row. And two of the figures, he said, were painted from our images of his sister, faces based on his sister. And it's all this group of friends going to Central Park and looking at birds, but of course, bird watching is a kind of aesthetic activity. So it's looking at something beautiful and coming together as a community. You know, I'm not saying necessarily that George was thinking of this when he made the painting, but the painting itself takes place in Central Park, not far from a kind of notorious gay cruising spot in Central Park. And I think that's one of the interesting things that goes on in his work, is that these paintings, given who is looking at them, would have different meanings. And there might be private, sort of semi-private, let's call them, meanings that someone who knew George Tooker, like Paul Cadmus, who would recognize his own face and know the people in it, would get a certain pleasure out of knowing that.
I think there's autobiography in all of his paintings. I think there's always an element that is very personal.
I have included myself at times in paintings. But that's partly because when I'm painting, the subject is always there.